Right, welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are rejoined by Nicholas Kaiser, who is the author of well, actually, you haven't put a new book out by this time, have you?
The new book is out yet, so I've got Revenge in the Name of Honor, which is
Yes,
about,
that's the one I was going to say, but there's another one, isn't there?
yes, there's also Ships, Sailors, and Sea Fights, which is a collection of 14 different chapters by 13 different authors on different topics of the navies of the long 18th century by Hellion.
Super. Right, well, we'll put a link to that in the description box. Go check that out because I know that there are a lot of very talented and clever people who have contributed to that volume. So that's great. I'm glad you're still producing printed material. And we will be watching your further progress with interest. Nonsense aside, today we're returning to the subject of the War of 1812, the Maritime War of 1812, and we're going to be honing in on something we briefly discussed in our previous videos. Again, links to them will be available for this video. And it's to do with the topic of something called sloganeering, which is something that we talked about, or a word we used in the last video. So, Nick, what the heck is this?
So sloganeering is the way in which the members of these two navies, the Royal Navy and the United States Navy, attempted to fight their conflict and especially to bring about single ship actions in a context in which the strategic implications in this context of the war don't really make any battle particularly likely. So the context we're looking at here is a very small United States Navy, I think fewer than 20 ships, certainly fewer than 25 ships, only about eight or nine actual frigates, the rest are quite small, versus the North American squadron, which even when the war breaks out in 1812, it is the smallest it has been in a long time, is still massive. And it's going to grow to a much larger state. So there's no prospect of large fleet battles, and there really shouldn't have been a prospect for many single ship actions. Early in the war, the commanders of both of the fleets, both navies, basically decided they didn't want their captains going out and seeking battle with the other for different reasons. So on the American perspective, even after the shocking victories, the really important victories early in the war, so Constitution and the United States winning their battles, the naval hierarchy basically decide that while these are great for morale, they're a huge risk because they have so few ships. And they would rather their cruising warships going out and doing the most damage possible, and that is attacking Britain's merchants. So essentially do commerce trade,
Right.
which is really important because at the same time, the British Royal Navy is blockading America's ports, and they have cut off America's trade. Britain wants to prevent actions between their ships and the Americans for the same reason. They don't want to, well, one, they want to focus on the trade protection part of the war, but they also want to prevent any more losses. Because the losses in 1812, as we talked about last time, had a huge morale impact on the Royal Navy and the British world more generally. They were shocking events, and the British Navy does not want it to happen again. But the captains and even the crews of the ships of the North American Squadron and the United States Navy, let's be honest, they want to go out and fight the enemy. That's why they're in the Navy. That's why they joined, they picked this career. In the British case, their morale has been wounded, their national honor has been wounded. They want to get revenge. From the American perspective, they see the chance for, unprecedented glory. How many captains, let's talk about the whole world here. How many captains can say in 1815, I once put my ship against a British ship and captured her or defeated her? I think about 5, 6 French captains perhaps could say that. Maybe a few more Spaniards, not very many. So you have this problem. The ships are being ordered essentially to avoid combat with each other. They're being told to prosecute the war in a sort of commerce-oriented fashion. And the serving captains, serving officers, are trying to find a way around that. And so they do that essentially by seeking action in other ways. That comes from some kind of either indirect or direct challenge, usually through some kind of slogan or some kind of press action.
Okay. Sounds very weird. But I mean, the motivation's completely understandable. The British, the Royal Navy is in the business of defeating its enemies at sea, but they don't know what's going on in America. They keep losing, so it's just sensible to keep everybody back until we can figure out what is happening. As for the Americans, well, we don't have enough ships to risk it being a lucky streak and, everybody getting captured in the next year. But I can completely see the 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 irritation, the angst of the American captains who are on this run, on this roll here, and they're like not being let off the leash. So this is fascinating. This is a fascinating idea. So this is a device used to get around sort of official military policy in North American waters, in the Blue Water conflict, we'll call it. And so it sounds strange. Like I say, it sounds weird, right? You're issuing some sort of challenge through some sort of slogan. Um, can you give us some kind of actual example so we can get a picture in our minds of how this works?
Sure. So, and I'll actually, to illustrate the point, I'll go back before the War of 1812 specifically, because there's one precedent that I could find. There are very few precedents of these kinds of challenges between ships. It is a really weird thing, as you say. I don't think it really happened very much. Now, in 1793, there was a challenge between the British frigate HMS of Boston, which happened to be sailing off of New York Harbor, to the French frigate, and I'll probably pronounce this wrong, Ambuscade. So this is right at the outbreak of the war, 1793. The French frigate was in New York Harbor, which, of course, is a neutral port. And what Boston cannot do is sail into the port and attack this French frigate. But who could pass up the challenge or the opportunity for this one-on-one action right at the start of the conflict? So what Boston does is sends a message ashore via a captured prisoner of war, and they ask the French to come out, challenge them to a fight. Now, the result of his action happened to be inconclusive. No one really won. Both ships get away with extensive damage, losses, but there's no clear victor. And so it's not an action that's really remembered by anyone in particular, except for the American press, because this was obviously a story in the New York papers. And certain classes of American journalists seem to become kind of obsessed with this because they start speculating on the prospect of further challenges between ships, for the next couple of decades. It always keeps coming up. And so when the War of 1812 breaks out, immediately there is speculation. Very early on, we've got a couple of challenges, both allegedly issued by Captain James Tacrez of the British Royal Navy, captain of HMS Guerriere, which would go on to be captured by Constitution in August 1812. The first challenge appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper, and it was a generic challenge, quote, to any frigate in the American Navy to single combat. So he's saying, coming out, any frigate at all, coming out and fight my Guerriere, my warrior. This probably did not happen. This is probably a false account put in the newspaper. I don't think James Ducrest actually issued that challenge, because there is a second challenge at the same time in a different newspaper, which I think was from Ducrest. So this was specifically meant for Commodore John Rogers of the United States Navy, who was the commanding officer of USS President, one of Constitution's sister ships. And this one said, quote, I'd be very happy to meet him or any other American frigate of equal force to President off Sandy Hook, outside New York Harbor, for the purpose of having a few minutes tete-a-tete. This seems more plausible because that is where President was, Sandy Hook. That is where Guerriere would have been operating. So it's a little more specific, more plausible. And there's a reason for Ducrest to target John Rogers specifically. And that goes back to an incident before the war. This is where the first kind of sloganeering comes into play. So early in the conflict, or sorry, before the conflict, HMS Guerriere had stopped an American merchant ship and impressed sailors off of it. The British alleged they were British subjects. The Americans alleged that they were citizens. The truth is they were probably both, because in the British view, you're always a subject no matter what. The American view, you can earn and revoke citizenship. So that's the heart of the conflict, really. So Guerriere has impressed these merchants, and President and her captain, John Rogers, set out in pursuit of Guerriere. I don't know what they were hoping to achieve. There was not a war at the time. There could not have been an actual battle between the two, but they went out. Now, President does not find Guerriere. Instead, she finds HMS Little Belt, which is a sloop. They come up against each other. There are confusing accounts of what happened, but we do know that shots were fired, and quite a few shots were fired. There was a significant cannonade. It is stopped fairly quickly because Little Belt is essentially ripped to pieces because she is a very small sloop up against the largest frigate on Earth, essentially. Both captains allege the other fired first. I can't really speculate on what happened, except to say I cannot imagine Little Belt's captain would have fired. That is an absurd thing to do. Perhaps an overzealous gunnery officer on one ship fired. We don't know.
There's a lot of pride in play here. A Royal Navy officer will not like having a shot put across its bows, even no matter how big the ship is. He may have felt honor bound to reply, and then everybody just goes off, and then someone says, "What are we doing with our lives here?"
Yeah. So this was 1811, so the memory is still really fresh. And when Ducrest puts to sea, when the war begins, he remembers that President had been looking for his ship, Guerriere, and not the Little Belt. So at the same time he's issuing this challenge in the newspaper, he has had painted onto his topsail, quote, not the Little Belt. So when he does get into action, the Americans can be sure that this is the frigate they're looking for and not the Little Belt.
That's brilliant. That's so, like...
And so again, that's why I'm fairly confident that that second challenge, which meant to John Roberts specifically, is probably authentic. But what I found quite interesting is that, again, the press in America were quite happy to print both, and there's a lot of speculation about both. This is something that the American press were really interested in, and there are a number of other challenges throughout the conflict that appear in newspapers, some of which may very well be true, others probably are just falsehoods. Another one that I'm, again, pretty sure is a falsehood was a challenge from Captain James Yeo of HMS Southampton, specifically to Captain Porter. So this again appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper, a Democratic press. Now James Yeo, he's actually more famous later as a Commodore on the Great Lakes. At this point, he's commander of a single frigate operating essentially in the West Indies station, so the Rhode Island station. Supposedly, he seeks to challenge Captain David Porter of USS Essex, which happened to be anchored in Philadelphia. And so the challenge read essentially that he's being challenged to a tete-a-tete anywhere between the Capes of Delaware and Havana, so pretty large chunk of water there. And Yo reportedly says in this challenge, quote, where he would have the pleasure to break his sword over his damned head and put him forward in irons. So it's a quite vulgar attack on this American captain. And it's surprisingly vulgar. You don't usually get this between officers at this time. They're expected to behave in a more of a gentlemanly manner. How they conduct their wars and how vicious they are in battle is one thing, but their public persona is expected to be a little more polite, to say. So my instinct is to say that this probably was not actually Yo saying this. But there is a possible connection that would make it possible. And that was Porter's recent history. So this is a relatively young United States naval captain. He was in command of Essex when the war broke out. And when the war broke out, a British sailor on his ship had come forward and asked to be released because he did not wish to fight against his country. Now, he was not in the American Navy because he was a patriot to the Americans. He was in the American Navy because it was safer being in the British Navy and it paid better. It was a common thing people would do at the time, maritime professionals. This one individual supposedly asked to be released, and Porter said no. Not only that, however, Porter then allowed his own crew to seize this British sailor, their former shipmate. He was tarred and feathered. He was sent ashore, ended up locked in the jail. And this was a scandal. Even the American Secretary of the Navy had to admonish Porter for allowing this to happen. It was a shameful display. So maybe Yo had heard of this. Maybe he was quite angry. There'd be reason to. Alternatively, perhaps David Porter had fabricated the whole account himself because he was now not in the best reputation he could be because he'd allowed his crew to do this. And so maybe he was trying to give himself an evil, nasty foil in Captain Yo to show him to be the more gracious and the more sportsmanlike individual. Because he offered a reply that was quite gracious. He was portrayed in that reply as the American hero responding to a great British bully, rather than the bombastic captain that he had been, where he allowed his crew to literally practice mob justice.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah, a lot of interesting things to come out of these examples. First of all, some of this, like the sloganeering of Guerriere is very clever. It's a very modern thing, to be honest. Actually, you could sort of see a modern parallel where someone does something like there's some sort of challenge to do something, and then the t-shirts are made, basically. You know, not the little belt is a very sort of t-shirt ad campaign kind of thing. Does what it needs to do. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. Also, it's just it is just such a fascinating aspect of naval warfare that you just don't get elsewhere. And I sympathize with the American press, to be honest, because this idea of doing a duel, duels are big press in the United States at the still. You have famous pistol duels still throughout Europe and everything like that, but the Americans have some very famous ones. And so the idea of two warships, so like inviting each other to tete-a-tete, which is just again, the language of it is brilliant. And why I also agree there's something a bit vulgar about the later declaration, because if you're using fanciful language to kind of invite this encounter, then you don't need to, be so outright. It's too obvious. It's too much of a slap in the face to be what it is. So these are fascinating ideas. But it's interesting as well that although it would appear that in the Guerriere's case, the challenge was accepted in some sense, that the encounter did not take place as it was intended. And the other one you mentioned might have been a fabrication and therefore presumably did not also occur. Um, so from this, we have about 6 minutes left in this particular recording. Um, from this, I'm wondering, uh, were there any challenges issued that did occur, that did occur, and perhaps if not, is there something else behind? Is there something? Do these sort of captains captains taking this sort of new approach to seek and destroy? Is there something else to it, or is this um, something else behind it in terms of the character of the two navies at play here, what they know of each other, sort of thing?
Mhm. So in answer, there were challenges. There were a few that almost resulted in an action, um, which is a whole other convoluted chain of events, which we'll get into, I'm sure. And there's one that definitely, well, I was going to say definitely resulted in a fight. It actually kind of didn't. This was when Captain Philbrook of the Shannon engages Chesapeake. So this was the most direct challenge that was issued in the entire conflict. A full letter written by Broke offering to the captain of Chesapeake, and we should definitely get into that letter, inviting him to come out and fight. It's very direct, very specific. It offered conditions. It was a very strange piece of warfare, for sure. And there is a fight between them. But the interesting thing is that Chesapeake had set sail to go and fight this frigate off Boston Harbor before the letter had actually reached the frigate. So the letter did not actually reach its intended destination. I think a lot of the motivations for this comes down to the point you made about dueling culture. This was an extension of dueling culture. The purposes of issuing these challenges, maybe accepting them, and then eventually, if they are fought, was about satisfying personal and national honor. And this was the supreme virtue for commissioned officers in the Navy, the British and the American. Though illegal, members of the armed forces, the commissioned officers, ignored those rules all the time to go and duel each other. In Jamaica at this time, there is a Royal Navy Lieutenant, Thomas Cecil, who duels and kills a superior officer, Captain Hassard Stackpole. Not only was he not court-martialed, but he was then promoted after he had shot and killed a post captain.
Please tell me he wasn't promoted to fill the gap he had made.
I don't. Well, I don't think so, but I can't be certain that they weren't thinking of how brash and crazy he was or how honorable he was when they made that decision, because it did come very soon after the duel. He was promoted during the war, and the duel happened, I believe, early 1814. So there was very quick turnaround time before he was promoted.
I mean, yeah, there is a reason why armies, and even if the armies didn't have the rules written down, that generals disapproved highly of dueling. The Duke of Wellington was very strict on this point. Although, as far as I'm aware, he didn't have a big problem with dueling within his army. I think the British army by that point had, to some extent, when on active service, kind of figured out, well, this is not the best way to do this. We should probably do this on our own time some other time. That being said, I'm just spiraling off into confusion here. Wellington knew a guy in India who did get killed in a duel, and he gave Wellington his horse, which he rode at the Battle of Versailles because they were good friends. Anyway, it's a fascinating idea that you can kill your superior officer if it's like a point of honor. There's a reason, obviously, why this is frowned upon, but it's very unusual, I would think. Zach White may want to hear about this. that you would be promoted or could be promoted after killing a superior officer.
And I guess the logic being, so yeah, he's violated a law, obviously,
Hmm.
by committing the duel. But if you're being intellectually honest on the part of the naval hierarchy, you can't if you are that wedded to the idea of honor being sacrosanct. Um,
Yeah,
Perhaps because they agreed to do this,
yeah.
it would be hard to actually, or put another way, they would not want to convict the individual for the duel and the killing,
Hmm.
because in their personal views, it was justified.
Yeah.
Because he was not court-martialed. That's the key thing. If he
Okay.
had, probably would have had to convict him of something, even if
Hmm.
it was just doing the duel.
Yeah. If the superior officer accepted the challenge, or if indeed it could have been seen that there was a distinct fault that could not be resolved, or although should have been resolved by a military court or within the regiment, um, then yes, outside of a court martial, there's a there's there in the culture we're talking about. It's not as strange as it seems, though we are starting to stray a little away from the Naval War of 1812 now, into Zach White's territory.
But it's all kind of, I think, linked there.
Hmm.
Because in the case of Lieutenant Thomas Cecil, he duels a captain on the same station over some probably petty squabble, as most duels kind of seem to be. But to them, it didn't seem that way.
No.
And to the captains around them, it wouldn't have seemed that way. It would have seemed something that would have infringed upon one of the two sons of honor, and that would again sacrosanct.
Hmm.
And on a foreign station like that, there's no admiralty there to actually
Right.
make meetings. This is all down to the local commanders. Court
Hmm.
martials were ordered by a commander in chief, and they were conducted by local captains. So maybe in this case, it was probably easier for them to just push it aside and not really do anything. Um, because again, that sense of honor mattered to them. And again, when it extends to the concept of a duel between ships, it's the same kind of thing. Um, the American captains had entered the war feeling that their collective honor had been infringed by British outrages. So we talked about Little Belt or the Guerriere impressing ships from an American merchant ship. A few years earlier, the more famous incident of HMS Leopard, a 50-gun ship of the line, firing on USS Chesapeake during a hunt for British deserters. These are things that the Americans really cared about, and it brings us into one of their kind of primary slogans of the war, which maybe we can talk about next.
Hmm.
Um, but um, this feeling that their collective honor had been infringed is a collective responsibility. The United States Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, had said before the war, the moment an officer becomes a commander, the honor and reputation of a nation is committed to his single judgment, discretion, and valor. So when you're promoted and made a commanding officer of one of America's very few ships, you have a huge weight of responsibility on you. So even though your mission is to go and raid enemy commerce, there's a personal and a collective responsibility in many of these individuals' minds to go and seek honorable contests with the British Navy. And they do this.
Yeah.
And when they've done this and they win a few actions, the British then have the exact same dilemma. They've now suffered these humiliating losses in 1812. And now their collective sense of honor has been infringed. And they now need to go and try to put this right.
Yes. And of course, you're away from all authority. Once you leave the port and once you leave the site of your flagship, you are your own commander, and therefore the honor of the country is up to you. You fly the flag from your ship. This is your country's territory on your deck. So this is why wars start when people mess around with other people's ships. There's a YouTube video out there right now, actually, which talks about never mess with America's ships because of all the major wars they have been in, they've been
Yeah,
involved in has been to do with some sort of shipping disaster.
I'm thinking again of well, as you say, Spanish-American War. I mean,
Yeah,
you could probably make the argument that the USS Cole bombing in the 90s contributed to the drive towards the war on terror.
yeah,
But
absolutely. So shipping is something that is highly connected to the foreign policy and domestic policy and just general politics of a country. And as you mentioned, that does tie in quite nicely with the how the War of 1812 started. So does sloganeering play a part in this?
absolutely, you can say that there's one particular slogan that actually leads to the war. There's one thing you need to kind of remember is that um, at this time, this is not a country with a strong executive. Um, the American presidency is fairly weak. It was meant to be weak. The United States
Hmm.
was envisioned to be a collection of semi-sovereign states with a united federal government with limited responsibilities. How that's played out over history is another question here.
Well,
Um,
indeed, this whole war comes out of the struggle between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So, and that is the core of essentially what they're arguing about.
absolutely. Now, one of the main motivators for the war party and their factions in Congress and then the state governments, whatever, is around the slogan "Free Trade and Sailors' Rights," which encapsulates the primary motivators going to war. There are ones in the background, the idea that the American Revolution is not finished because Canada and Nova Scotia, et cetera, are still under British rule. But the main ones that drive this particular conflict at this particular time are about how Americans feel that their rights on the ocean are being infringed by the British. So first, free trade, a motivator, part of a motivator for the initial revolution. A reaction against mercantilism, in which Britain had rules that they imposed on the colonies that said where and when they could trade. Um, and some of the backers of the revolutionary parties in America wanted to have more freedom to trade with French colonies and Spanish colonies and all the rest of it. So during this particular war, the Napoleonic era, the wars in that time, Britain is trying to get America to essentially buy into their economic warfare strategy. They're trying to get them to not trade with continental France. There's an entire blockade system trying to do this to limited success. And America is not happy about this. From the British perspective, who already don't quite respect America as a sovereign state to begin with, they just kind of get annoyed that the Americans are bothering to side with an obvious tyranny in Napoleon Bonaparte, and they think, why are you not siding with us? Because we share your general sense of liberty, and we share your idea on trade and all the rest of it. You should be helping us.
And all the Federalists said, "Yeah, we agree," and all the Republicans said, "No, we're republic. We're a republic like France."
Absolutely. So that was one big issue, the idea that their rights as a neutral party to trade wherever they wanted were being infringed by the British. And the other was sailors' rights. And this is all about impressment. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. I'm sure I talked about it
Everybody hates impressment. Nobody, no, the Americans, the French, Russians, Scandinavians, you name it. It's one of the most hated policies the British ever implement, and you can see why.
And it's one interesting too, because the British don't really impress in their remaining American colonies.
Hmm.
So in Nova Scotia, for example, there are really strict rules in place about when the British can impress. They basically have to go to the legislature, which is elected.
Yeah.
It's not a responsible government yet, but it's an elected government, and get their permission to impress. And when they violate those rules, there were quite literally violent riots in Halifax. There was one in 1805. So in a weird way, the British subjects who were on American ships were in more danger than British subjects living in British American colonies at the time.
Under the protection of direct British laws.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the level to which even the British knew that nobody liked the idea of impressment and the basic control. What is it? The right to search. Um, that thing. They knew it because in Britain as well, the British territorial waters, this was a big deal. They couldn't just
Mhm.
snag. They had to go through motions to do this. But of course, it's fair game if it's some other ship.
That once the ship is in international waters and it's not flying, well, so it's on British flag, but once you're in international waters, or even some coastal waters, it seems to be kind of fair game. And the problem you have from the American perspective here is that, it's pretty easy to become an American citizen at the time. Not now. I know people who are talking this right now. But at the time, it was really easy if you were, if you spoke English, really. That was a real requirement because there was less of a distinction between American and British at the time. The British don't understand citizenship in the same way. You can't stop being a subject if you're born in British territory, even if your parents aren't British. You're born in British territory. So whether that's Britain, whether that's Gibraltar, whether it's Quebec, you're a subject, and you can't change that. And the Americans believe, no, we can change that. And so that goes back to the sailors' rights. Sailors' rights to work wherever they want to work, sailors' rights to join whatever nation or navy or merchant ship that they want to. And so the kind of the message of this is, hey, you oppressed Jack Tar. Why fight for the king and be a subject when you could instead side of us and fight as free men? This was a very powerful slogan. It was a rallying cry for the pro-war faction before the war, particularly because the parts of the country that were the least in favor of the war, New England, did have a much higher proportion of sailors who would have been impacted by this. So to even get any buy-in in that part of the country, you had to use the sailors' rights kind of mantra.
The whaling fleets out of New Bedford alone is like what's the saying, lighting the world or something like that,
And so, like but not the little belt we mentioned earlier, this is a slogan that is quite literally put onto white banners, and it is flown from several ships in the American Navy during the conflict. It's the equivalent of the "Don't Tread on Me" flags from the First American War. So again, this goes through the heart of the entire conflict. It's the base of it from the American perspective, and it's there as a visual symbol in many of the actions that follow through.
That does rather lay a greater emphasis on the idea of the importance that this idea of sloganeering, which we have discovered in the course of this video, is some sort of strange blend of like the code duello and political pamphleteering, which is much more akin. Like the sloganeering is very, very much kind of something that political parties did. This is what we stand for. It's what people still do today. Make America great again. Sloganeering. It's still something that happens. It's just fascinating to see it 200 years ago being used as part of this kind of expanded dueling code. It's practical as well because you have to identify your ship as the one that has issued the challenge. So, putting not the little belt, I'm the guerrier. This is me. If that come fight and we'll have a fight. It's an easy way of identifying yourself. So, and it's really interesting how its sort of legacy in North American waters is very strong, and so it makes a lot of sense that this would be the case through the War of 1812, especially because you're not dealing with fleet actions like you mentioned at the beginning, where admirals are in fairly firm control of what their subordinates are doing. There's not the sort of roving commissions, like you say. It's very predatory warfare outside of. I mean, this is a bit of an aside, perhaps, but what was the state of the blockade on the United States in terms of fleets?
So it grows. It's pretty haphazard in the beginning. A problem for the commander of North American Squadron is that he has a lot of ships, vastly more than the Americans. I want to say around 90 when the war breaks out. What he doesn't actually have, however, is enough ships to do everything he's supposed to be doing, because his jobs are to blockade principal American ports. At first, it's primarily a naval blockade, so the major naval bases. Later on, he's asked to start blockading the major merchant ports as well. So he doesn't quite have enough ships to do all that effectively. The American coastline is massive. There are a lot of ports there. And Britain only has bases in Halifax at the very north, Bermuda in the very middle, and then in the West Indies, which are fairly south of American territory. But they're also responsible for convoying existing merchant vessels, because again, Britain's trying to protect their trade from the ships that do escape. And they're responsible for just generally hunting down American commerce and American commerce raiders. Now, that job gets easier over time as more and more American ships do get blockaded up. And at one point, over half the fleet, in the late course of the war, is trapped. And the fleet is slowly reinforced as the situation in Europe gets a little more favorable to Britain. In 1812, Napoleon's at his height. By 1814, emphatically is not, and the war does briefly end. And so many more ships can be routed to North America. So by the end of the war, there's a much more effective naval blockade. Again, a good chunk of the American fleet is blockaded, including some ships that have been building that essentially never get to sea as a result. And the impact on American trade does become, at one point, at the end of the war, quite dire for the Americans. Their trade is essentially brought to a standstill, and there's very little that their Navy can do in response.
Right. So it's definitely the case that there's a lot of scope, because you say the North American coast is very long, and it's subject to weather patterns of extreme violence at certain parts of the year. You can't keep fleets easily all the time where they need to be. You get bad storms in the Bay of Biscay and stuff like that for the Atlantic squadrons blockading the western coast of France, of course, and you still get storms in the Mediterranean during the winter. But like the level of hurricanes you can get coming in off the Atlantic is very severe, and you have to be very careful. And those ports as well are the graveyards of ships as well. Like these are notorious. There are notorious places across the Atlantic seaboard where that are just littered with the carcasses of ships. So you have to be very careful. It's not an easy place to blockade. And it sounds like you have a lot of ships, but actually it's a lot of ground to cover. So there's a lot of scope, especially early in the war in 1812, for this sort of thing to happen, where officers imbued with a sense of their own national pride, the pride of their organization, take it upon themselves to right the slights, done against their flag, as indeed the entire United States wanted to do at the beginning of the War of 1812 by defending free trade and sailors' rights, which, of course, famously was not really as big a deal at the end of the war as it was at the beginning. So with returning directly to sloganeering, does it peter out towards the end of the war? What's its sort of significance in terms of the naval warfare?
I would say it actually kind of rears its ugly head in an incident later on in the war. Whether American ships stopped flying the flags, whether the challenges stopped appearing in the newspapers, I couldn't tell you one way or the other. What you do see later on in the war is a move to more direct challenges. So these are when messages are sent by word of mouth or by written letter into a port. And I can go through a few of those if you'd like. There are some.
I mean, actually, that's a good point. You mentioned the famous one from Broke,
Mhm.
and you said it was interesting. So if you want to get into that, this is a good moment perhaps to look at that.
And with Broke especially, there's a story that's more well known, which is Sand and Chesapeake, and there's that was really his second attempt at a
Hmm.
challenge, and the first one was a catastrophe, which I like even more. So they both come in the context of the blockade of Boston, a principal naval base, very important harbor more generally. It's one that's only a couple days sail if you're making good time from Halifax. So it's fairly easy to maintain a blockade there. Um, there was a small squadron blockading it. We had HMS Shannon with Broke. We had another frigate, HMS Tenedos, and a few other ships. I think at least 2 ships of the line. One of them was under Thomas Capel, who I believe served as Nelson's flag lieutenant for a while. So he was the squadron commander. And their job was to blockade Boston. And inside Boston were several frigates, 2 of which were ready to sail at the end of May. And that was USS President and USS Congress. So President was one of the big heavy ships, the 44 guns carrying really close to 54 guns. Congress was a typical 38 gun frigate. So the respective force right now, you have 2 ships of the line, 2 frigates watching 2 frigates. So there's not going to be a natural battle without the Americans voluntarily coming out. So what Broke does is he convinces his squadron commander Capel to take most of the squadron and sail as far away as Cape Sable, so south of Nova Scotia. And look at a map. That is a tremendous amount of space. That is well beyond sight or even ear sight. So essentially what he's saying to Capel is go away because I want them to come out. And we're going to send messages ashore. Shannon will wait here, Tenedos will wait here, and we'll tell them to come on out and fight. And so the message do go ashore. Capel and his large squadron do sail quite a distance away for a time, and they're hoping that they're able to come out and have this 2-on-2 challenge. At this point, orders had been issued forbidding this kind of thing, but the orders have been quite specific. The orders from the commanding officer of the squadron, Admiral Warren, were that British frigates should not fight the heavy American frigates, the super frigates, quite sensibly. So this does break the spirit of the rule. Maybe because there were 2 ships, Broke could have argued that it was fine, but that's a challenge that they offer. Now, unfortunately for Captain Broke, John Rogers, a president, he is a little less concerned with honor and glory in this case. He knows he has a job to do, which is attack British commerce. He knows that he has been ordered not to seek battle with the enemy if he can avoid it. He's also not quite sure if he can trust the word of mouth messages coming ashore through, pilots and fishermen that the British aren't setting a trap. Because he does know that there is a large squadron somewhere. So he takes advantage of the fact that there's only 2 frigates left on station, not enough to watch the harbor in any meaningful capacity if there's anything but perfect weather. And when there is imperfect weather, they slip away. And it takes the British a few days to realize that this has happened. Broke is incensed.
Outrageous.
He writes home to his wife and he tells her, and then he adds emphasis to the wording in it. He sends the letters. They did not seek us. You'll hear they're doing mission. Lord knows where. So he is outraged by this. But this causes panic across basically the entire Atlantic, because the last thing the Admiralty wants is one of these heavy frigates getting away. And the Broke and Capel had disobeyed their orders to maintain the blockade, disobeyed their orders to seek this action, and it resulted in this ship escaping. And this could have been the end of his career if, because the Admiral would have started to figure out and would have started asking Warren, the Admiral Warren, how did this happen? And it's thankful for Broke that he has a stroke of good luck very shortly after. So when this happens, Capel and most of the squadron do need to leave to try and find President. They never do. And Broke is left with Shannon and Tenedos off Boston. Their supplies run low. And so eventually they're going to have to end the blockade. So what Broke decides to do is take the stores from Tenedos, loads them on the Shannon so she can stay a little longer. Tenedos goes back to Halifax. And then he sends a formal letter ashore to the captain of Chesapeake, which is now ready for sea. This is James Lawrence. And it offers a one-on-one fight. So it begins, quote, I request you will do me the favor to meet the Shannon with her, so Chesapeake, ship to ship, to try the fortune of our respective flags. So he goes on his letter, he describes his frigate's armaments to emphasize that they're the same as Chesapeake. He offers to warn Chesapeake if British ships appear before the actual action begins. He offers to sail with Chesapeake to any place Lawrence chooses to conduct their one-on-one fights. It doesn't need to be off Boston, doesn't wish. And some other things that I thought were just really, really interesting about this. He says, quote, you will feel it as a compliment if I say the result of our meeting may be the most grateful service I can render to my country. So saying that the best thing I can do for my country is to offer this fight with you, to, again, test our ships. And then he also adds, I doubt not that you, equally confident of success, will feel convinced that it is only by continued triumphs in even combats that your little navy can hope to console your country for the loss of your trade it can no longer protect. So he's saying there, we're winning the naval war on strategic terms. Your trade is gone. There's nothing your frigate can do except win a success by fighting me. So come at it. Let's do this.
So that is an insane story. First of all, the sort of comic opera of him trying to lure the Americans out into a duel, and not even with the intelligence of like, oh, we're going to lay a trap, we're just going to disappear one day, and then they tempt them to come out and attack them. It just backfires on all fronts so much, and he's so lucky that the Chesapeake, gives him the opportunity to just sort of brush over that.
Mm-hmm.
But even the letter he sends into Boston is just so incredible. He's giving like secret information. Like he's giving privileged information about his ship, his class, how many guns he has. He's offering to inform the Americans about the movements of British ships, which is borderline treason.
What he's doing is essentially, I will surrender any advantage I could have based on the fact that our Navy is so much larger than yours. And again, the Royal Navy being massive is like the primary strategy of the British war effort always. It is ridiculous. It seems less ridiculous when you're in the mindset of these captains where they feel like their honor has been infringed upon. And so they need to go and prove to themselves that any British frigate can beat any American frigate, even if one of those American frigates is the 24-pounder super frigates, which might not have been possible. Now, Captain Philip Broke was a uniquely gifted captain. He had drilled his crew into perfection. Shannon was a very deadly fighting machine, and she does essentially pulverize Chesapeake in about 11 minutes. It's a spectacularly short engagement. But the 2-on-2 fight with President. I mean, best case scenario, they do defeat them. I'm not sure that is as good as Broke was. President was a very, very, very tough ship to fight with her heavier guns and her larger crew. And Tenedos was not Shannon. It was a different captain with a different regime. I'm not saying anything about whether or not he was good, but I'm going to say he definitely was not a Broke, because Broke was a unique individual.
Yeah.
But of course, worst case scenario is you fight and you lose, which is a catastrophe, and then you're in trouble for risking it. And the medium case, which could have been quite bad, was you let them get away because you disobeyed your orders. You sacrificed your superior force, disobeyed your orders, and the fact he tries it again at Chesapeake, I mean, it just suggests the man's confidence, and he was very confident in his crew and his ship, but also the desperation. He needed that victory. His letters home throughout the conflict have been showing an increasing level of anxiety about the losses that have been inflicted, and in some cases, the losses were inflicted by people he knew personally. You know, he was friends with Captain de Crez. They had served together on the station for several years. So he took it personally. He felt it personally. He felt the pain they felt, and he also felt the pain of the collective Navy. And so for him, he was willing to, again, he was confident enough to risk it, but he was willing to risk it twice to get that final victory.
Yeah. And of course, he Broke had the advantage of knowing he had a very good ship and crew, and it wasn't even in a sense that he thought any other ship in the Navy can do this. I know my ship can do this, and so that's why I'm doing it. The fact that sort of gives license to other ship captains to technically do that as well. It's a bad example and a good example at the same thing in terms of chain of command and following orders and things like that. It just adds another layer of depth to that action, and it is the fact he sent that in, whether or not, I mean, there's an open question, to be honest, as to when Chesapeake comes out. Broke probably thinks he's accepted the challenge.
Probably, yeah. And so he was wounded while boarding Chesapeake. He was essentially delirious for the entire trip home and for many weeks after. And so naturally, the official reports of the action that were written by Broke were written by his senior lieutenant and the captains on station, because he could not write them. I don't know if he ever found out that, in fact, Captain Lawrence, who was just as desperate for an action as Broke, never received it. If he did find out, it would have been much later, after he recovered when he's essentially back in England in retirement. And interesting thing too is that Captain Lawrence himself had issued this kind of challenge. This had been a few months earlier, December 1812. He is the commanding officer of USS Hornet, which had won an action earlier in the war. No, sorry, this is a new Hornet. Named after a ship that had won an action earlier in the war,
right?
But been captured by the British, by a much larger ship. So this is a sloop. It is operating off the coast of Brazil. It's under overall command of Constitution's Commodore Bainbridge, and they were blockading Salvador, so a neutral Portuguese town. They're blockading it because there is a British ship there. One sloop, roughly the same size and force as Hornet. And so a formal challenge is issued. Again, word of mouth, not a letter, but word of mouth. Bainbridge, the Commodore, promises the captain of this British sloop, Pitt Green, that the sloop is Bon Citoyen. Basically promising him, I and Constitution will not interfere. My captain here, Lawrence, really wants to fight you one-on-one. I'm willing to give him that. Will you come out and fight him? And so that gives Green a real dilemma, because again, he's blockaded here. He's got these two ships, in sight, essentially. one of which he could fight one-on-one, and maybe he's confident he can do that, but the other one is Constitution, which is, at this point, won one of her actions already, and his sloop is a sloop. There's no question
I
there.
mean, even if he didn't know about the reputation of Constitution, sloops don't take on frigates. That's why the earlier we were talking about the Little Belt, the idea of that firing first on a large, any size of frigate is ridiculous.
So what Green has to do, he has to trust the word of Commodore Bainbridge. And the complicating factor for Green, too, is that his ship is carrying millions of dollars worth of gold coin. Hey, that is a huge risk apart from the ship he commands. Like if he loses it, he's in major trouble, right? This is a huge risk to undertake. So he does offer, I think, a pretty sly reply. I think this was an actual letter. And it said, quote, "The result could not long be dubious and would terminate favorably to the ship which I have the honor to command." So I'm saying right off the bat, I'm sure I could win this. But I am equally convinced that Commodore Bainbridge could not swerve so much from the paramount duty he owes his country as to be an inactive spectator and see a ship belonging to the very squadron under his orders fall to the hands of the enemy. They're saying, I know you promised this, I know I could win. At the same time, could you really shrink in your duty, Commodore Bainbridge, and risk losing a ship under your command? Several historians who've written about this have suggested that Green believed it was a ploy himself. I'm tempted to believe that, but I'm also, even if he thought it could have been genuine, I'm willing to accept that the risk, like even if he thought it was genuine, the risk was too much to agree to this, because it really is an absurd proposition. But Captain Lawrence, of course, was really upset by this. He had wanted this fight. Now he does soon after engage a separate British sloop, one that's operating somewhere else unrelated to this. And this was Peacock. And I know we talked about that last time. Peacock was renowned for being one of the prettiest and one of the least effectively commanded ships in the Navy. So it was not like it was an achievement, but it wasn't a spectacular achievement. And Lawrence, for his part, he got promoted for this, but he was promoted and given Chesapeake. He was not given something like Constitution, which he really wanted. He kind of felt cheated. He felt that he didn't get the glory he deserved from this action, and he wanted more. So when he saw the lone British frigate left off Boston, he took the chance. He took the gamble. Unfortunately for him, he was sailing his, the ship was not new, but the crew was relatively new. His command structure crew was new. They were untested, and they were sailing against one of the most effective fighting machines afloat in the world at the time. And of course, Lawrence did not survive.
Indeed, don't give up the ship. What's interesting about that is that it indicates to me that if Lawrence had received the formal challenge, that he probably would have accepted it. So
no question, because he was prepared to go and fight anyway. And it's possible that if he'd accepted it, he might have asked for a condition like, let's go over here instead, maybe. But I mean, again, he was prepared to fight her off Boston so that Bostonians could go to the lighthouse and watch, which is what some Americans who had the time to do so had done. Again, like, he was spoiled for a fight just as much as Broke. They were both hell-bent on winning this battle. My personal understanding is that Broke was a little more motivated by the collective honor of the Navy. And Lawrence motivated a little more by his own personal sense of honor. Like, I have not been given the promotion I deserve. I want to win this for me. But both men would have had some kind of combination of the personal and the collective honor motivating them in that moment. They both want the same thing in slightly different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. there's a lot of it's fascinating how so much sort of similar how the backstories just sort of fits so well into this the idea of the sloganeering thing and how the character of it continues um, throughout the war, to be honest. But you were mentioning before I suggested we talk about Broke, some other examples towards the end of the war and how it didn't really that it had some sort of a resurrection or a revival of sloganeering. So, well, what can you tell us about that?
So I'll start with the sloganeering ones. This is it is weird, which I think has been the theme of
It's just
this.
it's all weird. It's
Definitely very weird. This is actually went back to Captain David Porter of USS Essex, um, who was involved in one of the earlier newspaper challenges, who had led his crew tar and feather one of her shipmates. At this point, 1814, he's operating in the Pacific. He is attacking the British whaling fleet, essentially, and fairly successfully at that. He's got a small prize converted into a small warship. He's called it Essex Junior, very creatively, and they're running havoc. And the British have sent two ships to hunt them down. There's HMS Phoebe under James Hillier, which is a 38-gun frigate, and there's a smaller HMS Cherub, which I believe is a post ship. They catch up to them in Valparaiso, modern Chile, neutral port, spring of 1814. So both are desperate for a fight here. Hillier has been ordered specifically to hunt and defeat Essex, and Captain Porter really wants a single ship action because he is one of the few significant captains who had not yet had one. But Valparaiso is neutral. Neither can start anything while they're there. And the forces arrayed here, Porter's badly outgunned. Phoebe is a stronger ship in terms of the number, but also the caliber of guns, especially at longer range, because Phoebe has long guns and Essex has primarily carronades. Essex Junior is very poorly armed. HMS Cherub, the other British ship, is a post ship, so 20-some guns. So it's such a tiny frigate, but still a frigate. So what Porter does is he starts off with his free trade and sailors' rights flag. He flies that from the masthead. Hillier's ship then responds with their own flag, and it reads, God and country, semicolon, British sailors' rights, British sailors' best rights, weird grammatically, semicolon, traitors offend both. Porter then replies with a second banner, God and country and liberty, semicolon, tyrants offend them. So there's this literal war of words going on between the two ships. And then there's days and weeks of this where both sides are taunting each other. There are patriotic songs and banners that are being created and shouted and sung. Yankee Doodle probably would have been one of them. A midshipman on board Phoebe even composed a poem and sent it to Essex. I don't know what the text of the poem was. I'm sure I have it somewhere, but it was getting all along these lines, trying to taunt them into making the first move. And on March 9th, the crew of Essex formally challenged the crew of Phoebe. Quote, the sons of liberty and commerce on board the saucy Essex, and whose motto is free trade and sailors' rights, present their compliments to their oppressed brother tars on board the ship whose motto is too tedious to mention. That was a very strange God and country, British sailors' best rights one. And then they basically are asking, let's put aside an end to all this nonsense, and this is a quote, nonsense of singing, sporting, hunting, and writing, which we know less about than the use of our guns. So they ask, send the Cherub away, frigate on frigate, let's fight, then shake hands and be friends. And this is kind of what they say. Whether you take us or we take you will be to your advantage. In the first case, you will not doubt, for the service you render in a cause very brave and free men detest, to be turned over to Greenwich Hospital or to a new ship on your arrival in England. So if you win, you're stuck in the Navy or you're in the Greenwich Hospital and you're stuck in this rut. But if we take you, quote, we shall respect the rights of a sailor, hail you as brethren whom we have liberated from slavery, and place you in future beyond the reach of the press gang. So come on and fight us. Either way, you win. But if we win, your victory is going to be a lot nicer because you'll be free from the oppressive British. You'll come join us with our sailors' rights.
Okay.
Ultimately, there's no budge. What Porter and his crew are trying to do is tempt Hillier to accept a one-on-one fight with Essex and Phoebe. But Hillier's not going to do that. What's interesting about Hillier is that he's much older than many of the other captains, for example, Broke. And in my book, I draw a distinction between him and some of the other captains because of that. He's older, more experienced, he's earned his reputation already. He has a job to do, and nothing's going to get between him and that job. He's not going to surrender a superior force like Broke did and some other captains tried to do. He is going to finish the job. So eventually, Essex and Essex Jr. do escape from Valparaiso. They are pursued, and they are both taken by the British. And so that was the
that's a very dramatic sort of example.
It's definitely the strangest because again you have these two forces in a neutral port, and they resort to literal sloganeering to try and get something moving.
Even to the extent that they not only they start to critique each other's slogans. Like that's just bad writing.
Yeah. And what I wouldn't give to be able to observe like the planning for that. Like, they're getting together, a few people who can write, and they're trying to figure like what to write and how. Like, that would have been fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. Are there any? Do you have any more you want to talk about, or is that the punchline?
So that's a pretty good one. Maybe I should have asked a punchline, but there is one more, and this one, just brace yourself because it's weird and it's weirdly technical.
Okay.
And I learned about it basically because every letter that was written on the subject ended up in the Admiral's dispatches back to London.
Mm-hmm.
So in New London, which I believe is in Connecticut, there were a handful of American ships that were being blockaded, fittingly on the River Thames in New London. And they were under the command of Commodore Stephen Decatur, who commanded the United States. So it's a heavy frigate. He also has USS Macedonian, which is formerly a British frigate taken in 1812. And they got the sloop Hornet. So they're being blockaded by a squadron under Captain Hardy of Kiss Me Hardy fame. And it was impossible to escape. They are in a river. The mouth is very narrow. The British have a very easy job watching it. One of the British captains is Henry Hope. And you had mentioned earlier the prospect of Broke being both a bad and a good example to other captains. And Henry Hope is an epitome of both because he has followed Broke's career over the last couple of years. He has developed a comparable training regime on board his frigate Endymion, which is a 40-gun ship. It's got 24-pounders, so it's a fairly heavy frigate, not quite the American class, but certainly more than the standard British 38-gun frigate. And he also is inspired to seek action with the enemy, as with Broke. He is basically trying to get Captain Hardy to agree to something like it, to send word ashore, because Hardy's in command. So Hope is being a voice in his ear. And word of this discussion reaches the shore where Commodore Decatur is. He's heard from a merchant that the British are considering offering a challenge. So Decatur then issues a formal invitation for a 2-on-2 fight. He sends a letter to Hardy. He offers to put his United States and Macedonian versus Endymion and one of the other British frigates, Statira. Statira is commanded by Stackpole, the captain who would later fight the duel with the lieutenant and be killed incidentally. So kind of a few weeks follow, and they're basically negotiating whether or not this action will take place. Hornets commander James Biddle, he is trying to get on the mix. He is writing letters to people asking to be involved as well. So he's trying to get a 3-on-3 fight going. Decatur's trying to get a 2-on-2 fight going. And Hardy's trying to find a solution that works. Because the problem he has, he could put HMS Statira versus USS Macedonian. They're both 38-gun, 18-pounder frigates. He could put one of his sloops against USS Hornet, both sloops of war. What he really doesn't want to do is put Endymion, which is a heavy frigate, but it's considerably smaller than the United States. He doesn't want to put them against each other. Eventually, he kind of breaks down. He decides that the risk is too great to put those two ships against each other. So instead, he writes and he says, I have no hesitation whatever in permitting the Statira to meet Macedonian, as their sister ships carrying the same weight of metal. He was confident they could meet on even terms and Statira would win. But he says flatly no eventually to Endymion fighting United States, which Henry Hope was very disappointed by. So he argues essentially that they're not a fair match. American heavy frigates were too large, and Endymion was too small. So he couldn't in good conscience allow the action. And this came after weeks of letters going back and forth of Captain Henry Hope, being in his ear, begging him for the opportunity. Hardy has to make a responsible decision, but he has to make that as someone in the Nelson tradition who, again, wants to see British honor restored. He wants to see the Americans defeated. I'm sure it was a tough call for him, but he makes that decision. Stephen Decatur, in the end, is not pleased with that. The negotiations stall, and the Americans basically turned to the press to talk about how the British were cowardly and would not go ahead with the fight. Incidentally, Decatur then wrote to his commander, the Secretary of the Navy, and he asked permission to publish all the correspondence to show that the British were cowards. The Secretary of the Navy weirdly concluded that the Americans had come off worse in the exchange, and so said no to publishing the letters. And on the British side, all the letters do go back to their Admiralty, and they were never published. So I encountered them through the archives. So as a result, this is a fairly little known episode, but it is really fascinating because you get to see these captains. I mean, again, they're risking the blockade, they're risking this out and everything, and they're trying to engineer what both consider to be a fair challenge between 2 or 3 ships per side.
Yeah, what's fascinating about it is that Commodore Hardy is accepting that this is a legitimate way of prosecuting the war, that it is a legitimate way of defeating the enemy. It just sort of makes your mind explode a little with the repercussions of what it shows you in terms of what it means to the British to be the superior naval force, that they're willing to just do this because they know that we're the Royal Navy and we know we're better than the French, and these are all flukes. This American nonsense. We have to sort this out, and that if you can find a superior officer in charge of a flotilla of ships who's willing to work with his officers in terms of like crafting he's acting like a second for his officers in a conventional duel to see that this is working out. And you can see the same done at Valparaiso as well. The British part of that was correct because in a way, because it does raise questions if you put yourself in the shoes of some of the commanders. how on earth can a superior officer in a superior ship sit by and just watch as I take one of his ships because he's allowed it to happen? That would be dereliction of duty if there wasn't some this weird precondition laid down. Um, no, there are so many things about it that sort of characterizes as well now that you can use to characterize the naval war of 1812, these frigate actions and the wider strategy, especially when it comes to like the um, moments when the two sides draw close to action, when moments of action um, sort of become more likely. It seems to characterize so much of this sort the imbalance of the two forces as well. The British know they're superior, so they can't get the Americans to fight whenever they want them to. So they're having to like do double backflips to think of ideas as to how we can get these actions that we need to redress the balance. Um,
Yeah, and part of the reason they can't have these fights when they want to is that they show up with a immensely superior force because they are by far the largest navy. Well, they are the largest navy in this conflict, indeed in the world at this point.
mhm.
Again, that is their primary advantage in the whole of the naval war from 1793 to 1815. Is they can always rely, maybe not always over superiority all the time, but that they can have large forces almost everywhere they need to. And it's definitely the case in the United States in the North American context, because the Americans, again, have less than 25 ships, only a handful of frigates. So for the British to fight these even contests, you have to manufacture them because the Admiralty and the commanders have structured fleet operations to prevent them. They've given Hardy ships of the line and frigates so that if they ever meet an American heavy frigate, they will blow them out of the water. So to have those fair fights, the captains have to consider directly disobeying not even just the orders they were given, but the intention of giving them the ships they have in the first place. They have to send them away. They have to stand by. And again, potentially watch their ships lose. And so, like in Hardy's case, again, he was confident enough to let one of his frigates, one of his sloops fight the Americans. What he could not let himself do was let Endymion, this slightly smaller heavy frigate, fight the United States. So he drew the line there. Earlier, you had Captain Green off Salvador, who could not, he had to draw the line and not allow the contest because he knew Constitution was out there and he couldn't take that risk. Yeah, so like that's kind of a good way to put it. Like these captains do have to take the really good situation that they have strategically, and they have to decide how much they want to sacrifice to allow these contests, which they do desperately want.
It's been a fascinating talk, Nick, and it's been really eye-opening. Like I say, it's going to alter the way I look at the Naval War of 1812. Absolutely, from now on. And I feel like a lot of people will have not taken these factors into account when they've been thinking about it, or that these factors even existed as like a coherent, accepted, like front of the mind kind of evaluation for commanders on both sides during the war. So I really have to thank you for coming and sharing this with us.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it goes back to William James, who was writing about these battles as they happened, essentially, publishing right after the war. And he set out to prove why the British shouldn't feel bad about the losses, that they were outmatched in the case of fighting the Constitution and fighting the United States. And that was his mission. And that has been the deciding influence in British historiography since. And the problem with that perspective, he's not wrong in his assumptions. Like the Constitution was significantly more powerful ship than the ship she fought. But the problem with that paradigm is that the British captains at the time, especially those who did not have any more responsibility than the ship they commanded personally, they didn't see it that way. They didn't recognize it or they didn't care. And they wanted to get revenge, and they thought, we're the British Navy, we can do it. We had bad luck. We're not going to have bad luck this time.
Yep. But there's this other element also is that we deliberately handicap ourselves if we can moving forwards. And although there's not the same level of disaster for the British as there was in 1812 early in the war, during this period of them trying to entice each other to go and fight each other, you can see how it could have gone terribly, terribly wrong if one side didn't employ some sort of principle of it's just so interesting to look at it with these considerations as you've laid them out. So I think that we have shared with the audience this idea of fighting a war through sloganeering and using ships as if they're dueling pistols. The song and how the dueling songs in Hamilton now could take on a whole new meaning. And thank you for your time. And if you want to remind everybody about your collected edited volume, do so now.
Yes, of course. So again, just recently published, Sailor Ships and Sea Fights, Hellion Collection, 14 chapters, 13 historians, young and old. Some fascinating works there. Looks at a whole bunch of different aspects of navies in the long 18th century. That's from Hellion. I also published a few years ago Revenge in the Name of Honor, which is all about how the British reacted to the 1812 losses at sea, including the New London Affair, Captain Broke, Valparaiso, all the rest of it. NicholasJKaiser.ca if you want to get any information on how to buy them, look at other talks, etc.
Thank you very much for that. I highly recommend these books, and you can follow Nick on a couple of social media platforms. I'll leave the information in the description box. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. Think up your best slogan that would entice an American frigate out of a harbor and leave them in the description box below. Have some fun. We'll see if they come up to the standard that we've just seen. What would you use to rile up opposition? And with that thought in mind, thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe. Support the channel through Ko-fi if you want to keep me in coffee. And we'll see you again for another adventure in Historyland very soon. Thank you for watching.